Okay, welcome everyone. We're thrilled that you can join us. Good evening. My name is Ben Dworkin. I'm the director of the Rowan Institute for Public Policy and Citizenship, known as RIPAC, here at Rowan University in Glassboro, New Jersey. We are an institute dedicated to informing, engaging, and training Rowan students, faculty, and the public in applied politics and active citizenship. And so, on behalf of Rowan University and RIPAC, I want to welcome all of you to a virtual conversation with the Honorable Gurbir Grewal. This is one of several virtual events that we are opening to the public this semester, and we greatly appreciate your flexibility as we push through some of the technical necessities and challenges of the COVID-19 era. I want to thank our supporters whose generosity continues to support RIPAC's civic programming and intern scholarship programs, specifically PSE&G, New Jersey Manufacturers Insurance Group, and the New Jersey Utilities Association. I also want to acknowledge and thank our Rowan co-sponsors, including the Bentivoglio Honors Concentration, the Center for Interdisciplinary Studies, the Center for Responsible Leadership, the Department of History, the Department of Law and Justice, the Department of Political Science and Economics, Leadership Rowan, the Program in American Studies, and the Program in Disaster Science and Emergency Management. Here's how tonight's program will be run. I will take about 30 minutes to interview our honored guest, and then we will open it up for questions from the audience. You can see that you have a Q&A section there to submit a question. Now, many of you already submitted questions during the registration process. We greatly appreciate that. Several of them were thematic, and so we'll try and ask a few of those as well, just to get everyone as much as we can in the time we have. Let me remind everyone that tonight's program is being recorded, and all comments should be considered on the record. Our guest tonight is a lifelong resident of New Jersey. He graduated cum laude with a Bachelor of Science degree in Foreign Service from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in 1995. He received his law degree from the College of William and Mary in 1999. Now, his career includes stints in private practice and stints as an assistant United States attorney in both New Jersey and the Eastern District of New York. He was later appointed Bergen County prosecutor and then nominated and confirmed as New Jersey's 61st Attorney General in January 2018. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a virtual welcome to the Honorable Gurbir Grewal. Thank you, sir. I wanted to just jump in, Mr. Attorney General, and talk about your background, because you are unique in terms of your path here, or maybe not. Can you take us through your career path? Is this the work, being Attorney General, being the Chief Law Enforcement Officer for the state of New Jersey? Is this what you wanted to do when you were growing up?
Well, first, Ben, thank you for having me here. Thank you to Rowan, to RIPAC. It's an honor to join you and the students and others who've joined us for this conversation. Did I want to grow up to be the Attorney General of New Jersey? That's a hard no. I don't think I ever thought it was possible in the first place for someone like me to achieve this sort of position. And frankly, I started a long way from here. When I was growing up in Northern Jersey in Bergen County, to be honest, I wanted to be a writer. And I thought I was going to write the next great American novel. So I disappointed my Asian American parents by saying I wasn't going to be a doctor, I wasn't going to be an engineer, I wasn't going to be some other professional, but I was going to go to a small school in Maine called Bates College to channel my inner Thoreau and write the next great American novel. And so that's where I did my freshman year. I went up to Bates. A couple of problems with that decision. I had only visited the school in the spring, and I had never spent the winter in Maine. And so after one winter, I was convinced that I didn't want to be in Maine anymore. And so I had a roommate who had a stack of transfer applications. And I looked at him, and I found the transfer application for Georgetown. And I asked him, hey, Chris, are you using this application? Because this Georgetown School of Foreign Service looks pretty interesting. And I'm pretty convinced that I now want to be a diplomat. I want to be a foreign service officer, and I want to travel the world and represent the United States. So I applied to transfer to one school, got into the Foreign Service School, and was on track to take the Foreign Service exam when I graduated in 95. And then the State Department had a hiring freeze. They didn't offer the Foreign Service exam. I didn't have a plan B. So I did what a lot of students are probably doing right now and probably do when they have no plan after they graduate. I went home and I surfed my parents' couch for a while, and I watched a lot of TV. I saw some Law and Order marathons, and I thought this Jack McCoy guy is pretty cool. And I like being on my feet. I like debate. Let me try out law school. And so I applied to a number of law schools. I ended up at William & Mary in Virginia. Graduated from William & Mary, joined a big law firm in Washington, D.C., and enjoyed it. I think I would have been in big law, but for one event, which was my trigger for public service and the trigger for many people. For me, that trigger was September 11th. I was a young lawyer in Washington, D.C., and I remember that Tuesday morning like many of us do. I was driving to work, coming over the river into Washington, D.C. We started to hear the news about what was happening in the New York area. I went to the attorney lounge on the 12th floor of the building in which I worked at 1299 Pennsylvania Avenue, right by the White House. We had a view of the Pentagon, and we began to see the tragedy unfold. We saw the towers fall, and I remember that sort of surge of patriotism, and I think you remember it too. We all remember where we were when that happened. And we felt this surge of patriotism. We were under attack, and we wanted to do something about it. We wanted to help others. And there was this coming together like few times in my lifetime that I've experienced. And, so that lasted for only a short period for me, because I also felt this coming apart very quickly thereafter, because despite being born and raised, as you mentioned, in New Jersey and growing up here and checking all the boxes, very quickly, my sort of mourning and that patriotism turned to fear. Because I began to be targeted because of the way I looked. People saw my turban and my beard and associated me with the people they believed that were responsible for September 11th. A few days later, a Sikh American in Mesa, Arizona, named Balbir Singh Sodhi was killed outside of his business by somebody who wanted to exact revenge for the people he thought were responsible for September 11th. He practiced the same faith as I do. He looked a lot like me. And so, I saw how easily in that moment fear could overtake our sense of decency, and how the government needed to be there for all of us in times of trial and tribulation to protect all Americans. And so for me, I wanted to do something about it. And I decided in that moment that I wanted to be a federal prosecutor. I wanted to step up and protect others, and also promote understanding through my work, to show people that you didn't have to look a certain way or believe a certain way to be part of this thing that we call America. And so that led me to the U.S. Attorney's Office in Brooklyn. It eventually led me to the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey. And then one day, I was sitting there with my head down, and I got a call from somebody on behalf of the Christie administration saying, hey, we got your name from somebody. Do you have any interest in talking to us about the Bergen County prosecutor position? And I had to literally Google what the Bergen County prosecutor did, because my whole world was the federal world. And I said, man, this is such a great opportunity to make a difference in the community in which I live, where I'm raising my kids, to do it looking the way I do, to promote understanding, to step up, for others in the same way that I wanted to when I first became a federal prosecutor. So I jumped on it. I interviewed with the Christie team. I remember my first conversation with the governor. I almost blurted out in a confession, I'm a Democrat. And to his defense, he said, I don't care. I just want somebody with your background as a federal prosecutor to come in and take over these offices. And that was the model, as you remember, Ben, that he was following in a lot of these positions. And again, I was doing my job there in Bergen County, enjoying it, an incredible experience, able to put forward innovative policies to fight the opioid epidemic, promoting police community relations, making a difference, again, in the communities where my kids were going to school. And then somebody noticed, and I got a call from the Murphy team right after the governor was elected. And they said, and this is sort of funny too, and I might be going on a little bit too long, but it's an interesting story because you never know where these opportunities come from. That week where we have the teachers convention in our schools in New Jersey, we all go down to Disney World. They call it Jersey Week at Disney. And so I'm at Disney with my 3 kids, and I've got the little one at the Little Mermaid ride, and I got a call from Governor-elect Murphy's counsel asking me about my interest to interview with them about this position. And I said, I'd love to. And he said, well, can you come in tomorrow? I said, it's going to be a little hard. I'm in the middle of the Magic Kingdom. I've got Universal next day. Long story short, I came back. I went through a huge interview process, went through a series of, proxies that they had put in place to interview their candidates. And I was offered the job in December, on December 5th, I think the day after my wife's birthday in 2017. Sworn in right after I got confirmed on January 16th. And have been doing this work for almost 3 years now. Immensely gratifying. Again, able to stand up and protect others in difficult times, able to promote understanding through my work, able to build on some of the successes we had in Bergen. And, again, if you ask me when I was in high school in North Caldwell at West Essex, I didn't even think I could do anything like this. I thought there were too many barriers. I didn't have any role models. But I think, if there's one message to the young people, you got to be resilient. Just put your head down, do the best job you can in the jobs and opportunities you have, and people notice. And that's what happened in my case. And here I am.
So in your job now, you face any number of different challenges, and we want to try and get into some of these big topics. And the first one is really just talking about the system, because that's been such a part of the national conversation. I wanted to ask you, do you believe there is institutional racism within the larger law enforcement and judicial systems in New Jersey? Does it, in New Jersey, not national, just let's talk about our state, does it exist? And if so, what can be done about it?
Yeah, that is a question we're all dealing with right now in law enforcement, when it comes to government, and we're dealing with it across the country. And the reality is, when it comes to law enforcement, when it comes to the criminal justice system here in New Jersey, I think we have to acknowledge that we do our work here against the backdrop of centuries of racism, from slavery to Jim Crow, to mortgage redlining, to the war on drugs, mass incarceration. New Jersey bears the scars of this history like every other state. And that history is reflected in our criminal justice system when you look at the realities today that Black New Jerseyans are 3 times more likely than white New Jerseyans to be prosecuted and arrested for marijuana offenses. They're more than 3 times likely to have force used against them than white Americans or white New Jerseyans. Black Americans are 14% of the New Jersey population, but 61% of our prison population. And that's the worst disparity in the country. And when you look at our juvenile justice system, the disparities are even greater. So I think we have to acknowledge this reality, that these systemic inequities exist. And I think what we saw in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, we saw all of this laid bare. And we saw the rise of the largest protest movement in our nation's history, where millions and millions of individuals across the country, hundreds and hundreds of protests in New Jersey, of folks asking for meaningful, deep-reaching reform to address these inequities. And so we have been working to address this. You asked, what are we doing? We've taken meaningful steps well before the events of May to address these issues when they come to the criminal justice system. Starting in 2018, continuing to 2019, and I would direct people to our Excellence in Policing initiative. The details are on our website. But we focus on 3 things when it comes to policing: promoting professionalism, promoting increased transparency, and promoting accountability. And if you look at the directives and the guidelines we put in place, whether it's from reforming our use of force policy, training our law enforcement officers on issues of implicit bias, which we started well before the events of this year. Last year, we trained every last state trooper on implicit bias, every last prosecutor in the state, all 21 counties, every prosecutor's office detective, everyone in our Division of Criminal Justice to acknowledge that those centuries of history have left in us some degree of implicit bias. We absorb it. All of us have it, these unconscious biases, but we have to develop strategies to deal with them. So these are some of the steps we've taken. But I think the other thing we have to acknowledge right now, too, is that if we truly want to make Black Lives Matter when it comes to the criminal justice system, when it comes to law enforcement, we also have to acknowledge that we have to do the hard work of making Black Lives Matter when it comes to housing, when it comes to education, when it comes to the environment, when it comes to, as we see through the lens of COVID, healthcare. Because it's the failures of all those systems that sometimes lay this at the doorstep, these issues at the doorstep of law enforcement, where we're dealing with so many of the issues and the inequities that sort of pervade all these other systems and then manifest when it comes to law enforcement and the criminal justice system. So I think this particular moment gives us an opportunity for real meaningful reform across all of these systems to finally address this. And, you have a lot of students, and if they have spare time to read, go pick up Professor Glaud's book, Begin Again. He's a professor of theology at Princeton, and he writes about how we've had multiple opportunities in our country's history to address these issues. We had that opportunity at Reconstruction. We had it during the civil rights movement of the mid-20th century. And now we have it in what he calls our third moral reckoning as a country. And we have to acknowledge these systemic inequities in the first place, and then really commit ourselves to addressing them in this moment. And that's what we're trying to do.
You brought up the issue of the protests that came in the wake of the killing of George Floyd. But of course, we saw civil disobedience and protests happening even before. Black Lives Matter existed for years before this summer. Now, most of these protests and the protesters have been nonviolent. But I wanted to ask you about civil disobedience, because it seems to be someone who is as committed as you just expressed you are to understanding and rooting out, as you called it, complicit bias in the system. How do you find a balance between tolerance for civil disobedience and enforcement of the law? And what we're talking about is, so civil disobedience is not just the rally because we got a permit and we're here from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. What I'm trying to ask you is, when someone breaks the curfew, how hard do you come down on? When the protesters want to block traffic in order to bring attention to a cause, how do you deal with that? When protesters are chanting at patrons of local dining establishments who now have to eat outside, they're not violent, but what is law enforcement supposed to do when they violate these local ordinances and perhaps even state law? What's the balance that you see here?
Listen, you identify the challenge we face each and every day when we're trying to give our residents space to express their disagreement, to express their demands for change, to express their anger in this particular moment. Listen, all of us are angry. All of us who are human beings were angered by the images of George Floyd's killing, the reporting of Breonna Taylor's killing, the countless other police killings of Black Americans before and unfortunately since. So we have to understand that people need space to express themselves. And so some of that means us exercising our discretion as law enforcement officers to give folks that space. And I think what I am particularly proud of, and Colonel Pat Callahan and I have done probably dozens and dozens of meetings this year alone, but prior to this year, and other law enforcement officers have joined me in these community meetings. And so what we started doing in 2018, when we first got to the Attorney General's office, was to replicate some programs we had at the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office, some programs that we had instituted to improve police-community relations. In particular, what I made a point of doing when I first became prosecutor was to go and have regular community meetings, not invite people to the prosecutor's office, but go to the church basements, go to the school gymnasiums, go to the community centers, to listen to concerns that community members have, to build trust on what we call those blue sky days when there's no crisis around. So they know me and I know them. So when I became Attorney General, I wanted to replicate that across all 21 of our counties. So I implemented what we called 2121, 21st century policing, 21 counties. I asked every one of our county prosecutors to replicate this program on a quarterly basis. So that's at least 84 community meetings we had in 2018, the same in 2019. And we continued it even during COVID through virtual meetings like this one. I raise this to highlight that we have been doing the hard work of building trust between law enforcement and community. So we know community stakeholders, we know the folks who are protesting in our communities. And so we know to give them space. And I think that's why the Jersey experience, and we can't understate this, the Jersey experience has been so different than other parts of the country. We're one of the most densely populated states. We're one of the most diverse states. We have the same issues that other states have when it comes to policing, the same tensions. But by and large, knock on wood, we had hundreds and hundreds of protests, and they were peaceful. We had Chief Joe Wysocki in Camden marching arm in arm with protesters the first weekend after George Floyd's killing, arm in arm. And we had that scene replicate itself across the state. Protesters don't let you march in that type of protest if they don't know you. They don't lock arm in arm with you unless they know you. And so we've been doing this hard work of true community policing, which is more than coffee with a cop, about building relationships. And I think that's what's allowed us to escape the largely violent protests we've seen in other states. And we've given folks space using our discretion. By all means, if that line is crossed, if it turns to looting, if it turns to vandalism, if it turns to burning cars, we will hold those people accountable. But that was not the Jersey experience. I can't hear you, Ben. I think you're on mute.
I was told to mute so that I wouldn't give you background noise, then I forgot to unmute. My
Yeah.
apologies. Well, I wanted to shift to another aspect of state-federal relations, and that was your department's often litigious relationship with the federal government. In just a few years, New Jersey has filed several lawsuits, often in conjunction with other states, against the Trump administration. Policies on, such as taxes, healthcare, the environment in particular, safeguarding the election. These are just some of the areas in which New Jersey is suing the Trump administration. It seems like this is happening more than it usually does, and is now a real active part of state-federal relations for our state. So can you talk broadly for a moment about the state's legal strategy when it comes to these lawsuits? When I say the legal strategy, what are we trying to achieve? Are you just trying to delay things? Are we trying to roll back? Are we trying to simply voice as a state government, voice New Jersey's opposition? What is going on here?
Yeah, and listen, it's been more than a couple. It's actually been dozens and dozens of lawsuits that we've either led or participated in with other attorneys general in other states. But I think one point needs to be made here. I am not viscerally anti-Trump. I am not viscerally against everything that comes from Washington. There are other attorneys general who like to tout their legal battles with the federal government, who campaign on them, who raise money on them. That is not me. I'm not elected. I have the luxury of doing the right thing for the right reasons. And so for me, doing the right thing for the right reasons means standing up against Washington, against this administration, when I could answer two questions in the affirmative. Is what they're doing unlawful? And if it's unlawful, does it affect New Jersey? If I could answer yes to both of those questions, well, then I'll get involved. I'm going to get involved and stand up for New Jerseyans, because that is part of my job, to hold the line against this administration. And so there have been plenty of times where we've answered yes to both those questions and gotten involved when the administration has illegally rolled back environmental protections. We've gotten involved when they've attacked our immigrant communities. We've gotten involved when they've undermined critical healthcare protections under the ACA. Most recently, we filed and we won a lawsuit against the Postmaster General, as you alluded to, for his actions to slow down the mail, which we thought would threaten our state's ability to conduct a primarily vote-by-mail election during this pandemic. We also filed a lawsuit recently challenging the administration's decree that it's going to exclude undocumented immigrants from the census count, because that affects New Jersey. When you undercount the number of people here, that affects our seats in Congress. It affects the amount of money we get back. And so our goal has always been to push back against illegal actions by the federal government that affect New Jerseyans, because we want to make New Jersey a better place. And when they take steps that affect us in a negative manner, we get involved in it. But in an ideal world, I would never have to sue the government. But we've won so many of these actions we brought precisely because the administration has chosen to make policy without adhering to the rule of law. And so I say that because Republican attorneys general did the same thing during the Obama administration, but their win percentage was less than 10%. We're winning 70, 80, 90% of these cases because they are not following the rules by which you need to adhere when you're issuing rules at the EPA, when you're rolling back rules at different federal agencies. So that's really the crux of it here. I would much rather focus my attention here, pushing forward policies that promote a fairer and more just New Jersey, but I have to also fend off these attacks because they affect New Jerseyans.
Let me just follow up, though. For people who believe and view American society as being too ready to go litigate, there's too much litigation. Are the courts really the avenue for reconciling these issues of federalism between the federal government and the state? Is this really the best venue?
Well, in some cases, it's the only venue, right? When Congress fails to act as a check on this administration, when the administration continues time and time again to take actions that hurt our state, then we have to go to court. It's really the only venue we have in which to stand up. And I think, the fact of the matter is that we are prevailing in the vast majority of these cases. And I think that speaks more to the recklessness by which these laws are being made or rules are being rolled back. They're not laws. I mean, a lot of the challenges we bring are to executive orders or to rule rollbacks at different agencies. I'll give you an example. When we're talking about when I get involved, it has a real impact on New Jersey. I got involved when the federal government wanted to open up the Atlantic coast to offshore drilling. And so they gave a pass to a lot of states, which were mostly red states, but they didn't give New Jersey a pass. So I didn't want offshore drilling, along our 130-mile coastline. So we filed actions to figure out what was going on. We filed FOIA actions, Freedom of Information Act actions against the administration to get information. And when they didn't abide by the times in which they had to produce this information, we went to court to compel them to give us this information. And we kept pushing and pushing and pushing because our coastline is so important to this state. It's important to the environment here. It's important to the economy. And it's important to who we are as New Jerseyans. And because we pushed back, they stood back. They withdrew their plans to drill right off the shore here in New Jersey. So I think that's just one example. So I think too often this gets clouded that this is entirely about politics and other sorts of political issues that are going on in the background. This is real stuff to Jersey. Another issue which we pushed back on and got involved in, and the courts were really the only venue, is when the administration said it was going to roll back the DACA program. We have 18,000 Dreamers here in New Jersey. They're our friends, they're our neighbors, they're your students. They were invited out of the shadows and said, if you follow these rules and play by these rules, you could go to school, you could work. And so when they took reckless steps, Republican AGs took steps to roll back the DACA program, sued the federal government. The federal government said, you know what, we might not defend this, we might go along with this. We intervened to defend DACA. We flew down to Texas, this was in 2018, and we stood up for our Dreamers. And that's probably the most proud moment I've had as AG to this date. I saw our lawyers get up there and talk about people and the human aspect of the rollback of this program. And the Texas lawyers, I'm sure they're great people, they talked about technical legal arguments, about standing and jurisdiction. And we prevailed in that litigation. And for the time being, the DACA program was still alive. And so because of our actions, we were able to stand up for New Jersey. And so these are the types of cases, meaningful cases that affect lives here in New Jersey, whether it's immigration, environment, healthcare, where we get involved.
Obviously, we just talked about healthcare and mentioned that because I wanted to talk about COVID-19 from your perspective. Obviously, we're all being affected by it in some way. but it has been left to you in your office to enforce all of the various social distancing and lockdown provisions that have been ordered. And again, I wanted to ask you about how you find the balance. How do you reconcile the tensions between the governor's executive orders and the private lives and private property of the citizens in terms of your enforcing? How do you work that?
Yeah, listen, this is really the challenge that we're facing this time right now. In ordinary times, we would not issue, orders requiring certain businesses to shut down. We would not issue orders limiting the numbers on gatherings, on religious gatherings, or on all types of gatherings. So, we've been very careful. Our role here is to provide legal advice to the governor's office. So the governor's office is the entity that drafts the executive orders. We provide legal advice in the drafting of those orders, and when they're challenged on their constitutionality, our lawyers are the ones who go into court to defend them. And it is law enforcement, as you indicated, that are the ones that go, if there are violations, to enforce the orders. So, I think we've tried to find that balance between public health on the one hand and individual rights and liberties on the other hand. And so when we try to draft these orders, we want to make sure that they're facially neutral, that we're not, singling out religion, we're not singling out a particular group, and they're generally applicable. And that's really the constitutional challenge. And because of that, we've withstood challenge on every single one of them. There have been over 20 lawsuits. We were talking about the courts. This is cases where they were suing me. They were suing the governor. And we've defended every one of those cases successfully because I think folks recognize that this is an extraordinary time in which we find ourselves, which requires extraordinary measures which we would never contemplate in normal times. And here's the other thing. We talk about enforcement, and I know the governor in his press conferences in the past highlighted some of the outliers and the knuckleheads. By and large, there has been overwhelming compliance from businesses, from houses of worship, from different entities, because people have realized that the only arsenal we have to push back against this epidemic is social distancing. It is masking, and it is good hand hygiene. And so we realize that those things have to be front and center, and that's what allowed us early on to push back the first wave of this pandemic, and hopefully will allow us to get through this next wave. But by and large, there's been wholesale compliance. Where there hasn't been, we have gone to court, gotten orders to shut down gyms, to shut down restaurants that are not playing by the rules, because it's not fair to the 99.9% that are playing by the rules, right? Who are limiting their gatherings, who are not opening up to the extent that those rule breakers are, because that's what we need to do right now to make sure that public health is paramount.
I want to jump into, because we are now less than 3 weeks from Election Day, which of course started early because hundreds of thousands of people have already voted in New Jersey. Now, the Secretary of State in New Jersey, through the Division of Elections, oversees the process. But if there's voter intimidation, something that New Jersey has a history of, actually, it's up to you to protect voters. So this is a two-part question, because I want to talk to you about threats that you perceive. But let's start with this question. What's your confidence in New Jersey's election process in 2020? I mean, the scandal in Paterson during the municipal election there still continues to get lots of attention. I'm curious, do you think that kind of example is and attention is justified? What's your confidence in what we're embarking on right now in the electoral process in New Jersey?
I have complete confidence in the electoral process that we're embarking on, and we're taking actions to ensure the safety and the security of our system. I think, the Paterson example is a good one. When people try to break the rules, they get caught. We caught them. They're being prosecuted, and we're able to identify that. So, that was nothing with respect to the system we have in place. That was people who are trying to game the system, and those types of people exist in whether the election's entirely vote by mail or whether it's a normal election year. There are people who commit election fraud who committed election fraud last year, who committed fraud the year before, who committed fraud. So like these outliers are always there, and to hold them up as an example as to why this vote by mail process that we have in place because of COVID is not to be trusted is a red herring. They're identifiable. We've taken steps to protect against them, and so I have complete confidence in the system that we have in place right now.
So let's just talk about, because you also have to deal with foreign threats,
Yep.
Russian interference, various threats about people trying to break into the electoral systems, the computers, in order to change things. And we have domestic threats. In 1981, in our gubernatorial election,
Yep.
there were people who stood with holstered
Yep.
guns and armbands,
Yeah.
claiming themselves a ballot security task force.
Yeah.
No official standing.
Off-duty law enforcement officers.
Right. They were off-duty law enforcement officers. And they weren't in every district, but there were people in every district. Some of them held firearms. Can you just talk about how
Sure.
are you handling this? Is this even allowable at this point? Aren't they just citizens standing outside a prescribed distance from the entrance to a polling place? How are you handling this? What are you seeing as these both foreign and domestic threats to voting security?
So certainly, we're mindful of what's happening when it comes to voter intimidation in other parts of the country and some of the reporting that we're seeing about what's happening in and around polling locations. And certainly the cyber threat is something that we're always mindful of. This is something that we test on, we exercise on, we have tabletops on. We had it, in last year's election cycle, the previous year's election cycle. It's something that we work with our Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness. We work with our federal partners. We're constantly preparing for the hacker, the intrusion, the threat to the infrastructure, and we're also constantly vigilant because that's one aspect of the foreign threat. The other aspect, which is perhaps more pernicious, is the disinformation. They're trying to feed on the discord that's being sown here by some people that you can't trust the system, that you can't trust the outcome of the system. And these are largely foreign actors who are doing this. And our Office of Homeland Security and Preparedness has put out some literature on this topic so people can be more informed about what outside actors are trying to do to take advantage of our system. You talked about the 1981 gubernatorial election, where you did have these off-duty law enforcement officers who put themselves out there as a ballot security task force, wore armbands, wore their weapons. That prompted, as you know, a series of legislation that limited the presence of on and off duty police officers in polling locations. It put strict restrictions on who could be there, who had primary authority in our polling locations, how it's the civil election workers that really dictate how things are run. They could rely on law enforcement. So all those rules are in place. The voter intimidation laws in our state are strong. The federal rules prohibiting federal law enforcement and federal officers and soldiers from coming into polls are even stronger in some cases. So when the president says he's going to send all this law enforcement, federal law enforcement to polling locations to ensure the security of elections, that's not allowed by federal law. And so, that's precisely to prevent the type of intimidation we've seen happen in the past. So, we're taking a lot of steps behind the scenes that we're advising our law enforcement officers of what the rules are, what the limits are, where people can electioneer, where they can't, what can be said where, who does what, and just the primer that we need to have in place along with our Secretary of State to make sure we're fully aware of the rules of the road, that we know what the laws are, that we're not out there unnecessarily. So, some people are intimidated by that presence. So we have these laws that we're abiding by them. And again, that is not an issue here, but we're just being prepared. And I think that's all we can do, be prepared for everything leading up to the election and for the days after. And so we're constantly in communication with each other and with our federal partners to make sure that we're doing everything possible to ensure a safe and secure election.
I want to jump into some of the questions in the few minutes that we have left. Some of the questions that came in from people who registered. And there were several questions about marijuana, which is on the ballot and may well be legalized if it passes. with the ballot initiative this November. From your perspective, can you explain your position on both legalization and the expungement of records for possession? And a second part of this, just what is the most challenging part of enforcement of the law if legalization becomes approved? How do you, we don't have a breathalyzer in the same way that we would say with abuse of alcohol when you're operating a vehicle. So if you're operating under legalized marijuana, how is law enforcement going to even be handling that? Can you talk about this issue for a little bit, please?
Absolutely. And so on the first question, I'm going to punt that legalization, and this has been my standard answer, is a ballot question now. Before it was a question for the legislature. And the reason I punt, so the listeners can understand, is that if I'm on record saying this law is no good or this criminal statute should not be abided by, I can't do that. I can't have people who are charged with that law out there citing the attorney general saying that this law shouldn't be on the books and so on and so forth, and use it as point 1A and point 1B in their briefs to dismiss the charges against them. So I have not commented on statutes and that the legislature is considering, whether it comes to marijuana or other questions related to this issue. So it's a ballot question, not for my comment. We'll enforce the law, whatever the voters and the legislature ultimately decide, and that's my role in this regard. On expungement, however, we have a clean slate of expungement law that was enacted. It was enacted pre-COVID, and it put in place a number of deadlines by which certain provisions of the expanded expungement law were to take effect. Now, because of COVID, the governor, through executive order, has pushed that back till February 15th of 2021 to give us more time to build up the systems for this automatic expungement, including low-level marijuana offenses. So we are working hard to make that a reality. We're going to hire about 150 people in the state police, which handles all the expungement, to make sure that we're abiding by the requirements in the new law, that people who meet the qualifications, and they're pretty strict on the clean slate law, and then on the disorderly persons marijuana offenses, that they're expunged and sealed, that happens quickly, so it doesn't prevent somebody from seeking a job opportunity, and that we could to make that law a reality. But we need a little bit more time for that to happen, and we're working hard right now to make sure we meet those deadlines.
We've got about 5 minutes left of the time that I promised you, sir. So there are two last questions
Sure.
that I want to get to that were submitted by people. One clearly came from a student here, and it was, what advice do you have for undergraduates who are looking to go to law school?
Well, I mean, listen, I would say, my path was a little bit circuitous. It's not something that I had thought about in undergrad. And, remember, failed writer, failed foreign service officer, saw Law and Order Marathon, was interested in being a stand-up litigator, decided to apply for law school, but for 9/11 wouldn't be on a public service journey. So there were a lot of triggering events for me, intervening events that led me on this path. So, for those who are going through this, I would just say, you need to be resilient, because you might plan that things will happen a certain way and sometimes they don't. So be resilient about it. But for those of you who are looking to go to law school, I think the biggest skill that I think you need when you're getting into law school is the ability to sort of identify issues, to read critically, to whether it's case law, not just reading it for the sake of reading it, but sort of putting your mind into the case. What are the issues being presented here? What is the rule that the case is putting forward? And then I think work on your writing. Work on your writing and be economical in your writing, and start early. I always tell people who, when I edit their stuff, and I've been known to have a pretty heavy hand as an editor, I tell them, pretend that words cost money, and you only have a limited amount of them, and be economical and just get to the point, and don't use too many words that end in ly. You don't need these excessive descriptors. Just get to the point quickly. So, work on your writing skills. work on your ability to read critically at IssueSpot. One way to really discern whether or not you want to get into law school is take advantage of internship opportunities at my office. We hire college students both on the criminal side and on the Division of Law side. That is a perfect opportunity for you to see what the feel of this place is like and whether it's for you.
I just want to interrupt. Is that even happening during COVID-19?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. We have interns working virtually. We had our summer internship program. We ran it. It was a little bit scaled down, but we did it virtually. I had the opportunity, as I always do, to address the interns on one of these massive Zoom meetings. And listen, we'll take the free work however we can get it, whether it's in person or socially distanced. It's something that we rely on a lot, but I think it's a great opportunity for each of you to see whether public service work is for you, whether being a lawyer that works in government is for you, whether you're working at a law firm or wherever, or at a courthouse. It's a great opportunity for you to see what it's exactly like, and I think it's invaluable. And that's what I would recommend. Seek out those opportunities too.
As the final question, and I appreciate the time, sir, it's a bigger thought question, because it seemed to be that it would be appropriate to end tonight's discussion with perhaps the most fundamental question for someone in your position. If you're going to stop crime, then it helps to have an idea why crime exists. And so the question that came from one of our registrants was, why do people commit violent crimes? Are there just bad people in the world? Is it a function of poor education, healthcare, family structure? We've heard people accuse images of violence in the media and video games. Is it a proliferation of guns, or lax enforcement of existing laws, or minimal punishments when you do get arrested? And even if all these things had something to do with why we have specifically violent crime, based on your experience, which one is the biggest contributor to why we continue to have violent crime in New Jersey?
We have a minute left. I mean, listen, that's a profound question. Yeah, it is truly a profound question, and I'm not sure. It's probably all of those things and more. It's probably all of those things and more for sure. I don't have a quick answer to that, and I don't know which of these issues it is. What I could tell you is what I'm trying to do from my position, in addition to enforce the criminal laws that are on our books, and in addition to the oversight of law enforcement, in addition to the oversight of the county prosecutors, which I have, I'm also looking at ways to break cycles, cycles of crime. And when I look at violent crime, right, I see a lot of young people who walk around with unaddressed trauma, right? Whether it's hearing gunshots in their neighborhood, whether it's growing up in the midst of a gang war, there are young people in our midst who have so much trauma, and it's never been properly addressed. So we have invested in programs in Trenton, in Atlantic City, in Newark, and other places to address that trauma, to work with community partners to address that trauma. We have tried to think creatively about gun violence. We are certainly pushing back against bad manufacturers that are selling large capacity magazines into our state, against criminal actors who are bringing guns in from out of state and selling them to bad actors in our state. But to disrupt cycles, we just invested $20 million in hospital-based violence interruption programs. And so what we saw, proven in other parts of the country scientifically, was that when you have these programs in place, the recidivism rate for gunshot victims goes down dramatically. It goes down from double digits to single digits. And so we wanted to develop these programs, and we now have them, I believe, in 9 hospitals across the state, where when there's a gunshot victim that comes in, a team of people, including community members, people from the community, people from the hospital, people who are expert in dealing with this, people who have gone through this themselves, go to the bedside and talk to the person about how they could break this cycle, about how there's something else. And so, we're doing the same thing when it comes to addiction. I mean, I don't think addiction was mentioned in the question. Sometimes addiction fuels crime and fuels violent crime. So we've been trying to look at ways to disrupt cycles of addiction and arrest and incarceration. We're looking at ways to invest in young people and get them off the path to being in the criminal justice system into diversion programs. In the next week or two, we're going to put something forward that really focuses on decarceration and restorative justice when it comes to our young people who commit crimes. It's going to talk about how station house adjustments, where the cop sits down with the parent or a family member, a community person, to come up with an alternative to the criminal justice system for a young person, or a curbside adjustment. We're putting together this directive that'll focus on that, because that's the front end of the system. We don't want young people getting involved in the system to begin with to end up in the adult system. So, those are the solutions I'm looking at. I'm not smart enough from a criminology perspective, and I haven't studied root causes of crime to give you a more scientific answer than that. But I could tell you we're taking huge steps in the state to get away from the way things were done, to invest in intervention, interruption, and restorative justice programs to break cycles for people. And so we could reduce crime, and in particular violent crime, in that manner.
I appreciate your attempt at that answer, and I appreciate everything that you've spoken with us about tonight. You may well be trying to break cycles that lead to very negative social impacts, but there is so much to talk about with you, sir. I hope we can recycle you back in at some point and continue this conversation. On behalf of the Rowan Institute for Public Policy and Citizenship, RIPAC, I want to thank Attorney General Grewal for this wonderful conversation. Thank you all for watching and joining us. We look forward to having you again at our future events. Let me just give you a heads up on December 1st. So after the election, we will have Steve Kornacki from MSNBC coming to talk about what just happened. And hopefully by December 1st, we will know. Something to look forward to. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Attorney General Grewal, thank you so much for being part of this. Everyone, have a great evening.
Thank you, Ben. Stay safe.
You too.